Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I'm Connor, and that there is Evil Greg, also known as Mr. Phil.
What's up?
What's up, Greg? How you hanging, bruh?
Too bad, bro.
I'm going to try to con you into doing your American accent, since I'm always embarrassing myself doing my my various British Commonwealth accents.
I'm doing right fine. That's exactly what Greg would say.
That's so Greg.
Yeah.
I gotta say, I do have a real soft spot for Brits doing American accents, because they're always horrible, but in a way that is delightful to my ear. You all right? Hey, how's it going there? I can sort of do a Brit doing an American accent pretty well, actually. That's the only accent I can do well.
Yeah, I'm always a big fan of the of the person doing their own accent badly. Is always a great one.
Oh yeah, of course. Jimmy McNulty in The
What's his
Wire.
face in The Wire when he's
Yeah.
A British person.
Spot on. This is Heavy Hands. We're not talking about accents. Instead, just for a change of pace, we thought we would talk about some mixed martial arts. And in particular, we are in the unusual circumstance of being smack dab between two UFC cards. Who could have guessed? Last week, the UFC went to Mexico City, and more than anything else, I have to say, you know, as all of these travel cards tend to be, except for when they go to fucking Saudi Arabia, just an affirmation of life to hear a live crowd roaring with excitement. And, you know, few crowds love an action-packed fight more than the Mexican crowd. And you could feel it. The fighters delivered in response to that energy. There was a good vibe in that arena. We got some very good fights. And certainly no exception. The main event was at the very least very interesting. That was between Brandon Moreno and Steve Erceg. But I think that energy was kind of throughout the whole card. There were some weird ones, but there were also some really exciting bouts sprinkled all across the main card and the prelims too. And just to remind us what we are actually deserving of, the UFC is returning to the Apex next weekend with Josh Emmett versus Lerone Murphy, which, by the way, that would be a better fight with the crowd. No question about it.
Yeah.
It's almost like you see the middleweight main events at the Apex, you're like, God damn it, another one? And then they put like a cool featherweight fight in there, and you're like, they don't deserve this. Keep it.
Well, alternatively, you know, they could have put, maybe they couldn't. They could have put Lerone Murphy perhaps on that London card, which wasn't very good.
That would have made sense. Yep. But they probably already had this booked, and they needed their main event for this because the schedule dictates all.
I mean, and also to be fair, without that main event, this card would not be good.
Yeah, but it's barely good as it is. So, I mean, at this point...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's okay, it would be really bad.
Yeah, it would be dire.
Yeah.
But, you know, if they've made Brad Tavares, Gerald Mearshart the main event, because that's the first middleweight fight here, you would just be like, okay, whatever. I can skip this one. You know, enough pretense. Just let us know which ones we can skip.
Yep.
Anyway, Josh Emmett, Lerone Murphy is an interesting fight. Certainly a second or third chance, I suppose, for Lerone Murphy to prove that he does have what it takes to be an elite fighter, given the sort of up-down across his last two performances in the decision-making you would expect from an elite fighter. But I would like to lead off with the main event from last weekend, actually. We didn't lead with it last week. We're like, people are going to care about Leon Edwards more. And probably people will care about Emmett versus Murphy more than the flyweights because people hate flyweights. But guess what? This was an interesting fight. And I want to revisit the discussion of Steve Erceg, how the UFC handles prospects, and pick up on some of the particular struggles he had and how those may or may not relate to his inexperience. The fact that he is, keeping his head above water, but definitely swimming in a part of the pool that is too deep for him right now. He should be wading still. Brandon Moreno, Steve Erceg. What did you think, Phil?
I didn't think this was very good.
All right. Counter to my opinion. I didn't think it was bad at all.
I mean, I didn't think it was bad, but it was a fight where I kind of felt like... So, the classic example of like what we would class as a not particularly good fight is one where the same exchange just happens over and over again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we just see the, people just adapting within like a tiny box of like techniques and spaces and so on, and all they'll do is go like change one thing every time out of the 3 different things that they're doing, and it will just repeat over and over and over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't that. And the best ones are a back and forth of adaptation and people, figuring stuff out and then counter figuring things out.
Right.
And, and they tell a story. And
momentum shifts. That's what we're always looking for, right?
And this wasn't really one of those either. I think what made it feel a little bit dispiriting was that I felt like both men adapted in fundamentally negative ways. Is that they adapted to take things away from their opponent, and then that was it. And so we got a fight which was kind of progressively less action-packed as it went on, and not because either man was tiring out or anything like that, but simply because they had both figured out how to not have too much happen. And their adaptations had been mostly kind of negative in nature. And, didn't think it was particularly great. I did think it was interesting. Like I said, it wasn't just one of those ones where you just watch a minute of the fight and you know exactly what you're going to get. You could just, you could just loop it like it's the camera from Speed.
Right.
Just you see the character. Suddenly, you see that like there's a glitch on the screen that's been appearing at the same point every 58 seconds, and you're like, oh my god, this 25-minute fight has only been 1 minute.
I've been had. Again.
Yeah. Actually, both fighters have escaped long ago.
They're in the dressing room drinking margaritas. God damn it.
But yeah, this wasn't like that, but it did feel like a fight where actually both men kind of figured out ways to get less done over the course of the fight rather than more. Both kind of figured out that their opponent was extremely limited in one way or another.
Yeah.
And they were like, well, if I just solve this problem about him, then he won't be able to do anything. And that was true. It was true.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that, actually. And to be clear, I'm not saying I think this was a fantastic fight. It was particularly interesting, even in that specific aspect, though, to me, because of, the frame through which I was viewing it, which is being quite down on how the UFC is handling Steve Erceg and, looking to confirm my bias throughout the fight. Looking for evidence of him not being ready for this level. And I think, unfortunately our prognostication that the UFC was going to take a very promising contender, and turn him into a guy with 3 straight losses, who is probably now, perhaps never going to actually achieve his potential because, he's struggling to stay afloat. He's not going to learn how to swim butterfly at this point. That I think was proven simply by the result. Steve Erceg very clearly lost this fight. You know, he was 3-0 before
I saw some people saying that they thought that he might have won it, but
no,
I didn't really see it.
Absolutely not. No. So, you know, looking at it through that lens, I was picking up on that exact aspect that you mentioned, Phil, the negative adjustments. I want to point out two pieces of advice from Steve Erceg's corner in this fight. And I have them written down in some notes here. Might take a moment to find them. And I'll be paraphrasing, but I promise I am not mischaracterizing what was said. First, I think it was after the first or second round. It was after the first round. They said to him, so he's reading your jab, which Moreno was. He was countering Erceg's, particularly his pawing jabs, really, really well in that first round. You know, dropping under, overhand right, slipping inside, left hook to the body, all kinds of ways of punishing Steve Erceg's jab. They said, so he's reading your jab, so if you want to go with that, you got to go high guard. That's the only thing defensively. And I thought, that's the only thing defensively? Maybe this isn't the time to bring up the real defensive issues. Because you're not going to learn good technique in the middle of a fight. But also, how's a man supposed to keep his jab going and go high guard at the same time? How is that advice supposed to stop you getting your jab countered if you're still supposed to be using your jab? Contradictory. Then later, after maybe the third round, they told him, you're seeing the shots coming, which he was, as you said. He made the negative adaptations. He started to get a read on Moreno's, you know, 2 or 3 main tricks, so to speak, and a lot of those shots started to miss. They said, you're seeing the shots coming, but we need you to get your own shots off too. And it occurred to me that that was just as impracticable as the other piece of advice. Because what kept happening is Brandon Moreno would throw, and when he threw in combination, sometimes they would land, sometimes he would whiff, one way or the other. When Steve Erceg felt forced to react defensively, there was no option for offense from him. He's leaping out of range, he's leaning away, he's standing up way too tall, he's staying just ahead of this tidal wave that is threatening to drown him. And this happened twice in that round, in the round following that advice. He would be driven back by some big combination. One of the ones I recall, some good shots were landed. One of the other ones, every single shot missed or was blocked. But then Steve Erceg thinks, now I got to get my shots in. And being an inexperienced fighter, he thinks, now it's my turn. That's the natural impulse of an inexperienced fighter, right? You go, I go. And so then he waltzes back in, sticks out his jab, tries to get something going, and immediately Moreno steals his turn from him and lands a much bigger shot than was connected in the combination which preceded that moment. Erceg gets driven onto the back foot. He survives. He escapes terrible damage. He thinks, now I got to get my shots off like my corner said. And the moment he tries to mix it up, Moreno just reads that he's about to step into range and cracks him both times with a big overhand right. And that is, I think, really emblematic of the problem that Erceg is going to continue to have if he keeps fighting this level of competition. That the actual solutions to the problems he's having in these fights are not available to him. He doesn't have, first of all, the kind of just fight sense that a guy like Moreno has. I mean, Moreno is one of the most experienced fighters in the entire UFC at this point. Mm-hmm. You can critique his technique and call him weird and inconsistent and you'd be right. But when it comes to kind of feeling opportunities without having to think about it, there's no question that he is sharper on the instinctive reads than a guy like Steve Erceg. And
this came to him after quite some time. Like, he was famously
exactly,
not a very good striker for the first half of his UFC career.
Yeah. But also that Steve Erceg's corner cannot give him advice which both keeps him safe and allows him to actually bank rounds or damage the opponent at this level. They're incompatible. Because anything he does defensively, which is his big liability as a striker, is going to neuter his offense. And anything he does offensively is going to introduce him to the opponent's offense. Just as a rule. And this was a problem he ran up against all throughout the fight. That he could have, there were long stretches as the fight wore on where Erceg was getting a lot of good touches in. And I almost thought he was kind of coming to the realization of what we had kind of projected as like a winning game plan for him. Like, yep. Moreno's going to look bad if you stay at long range. And he did, making Moreno swing crazy wide shots and miss by a mile. And he was touching him with the jab, and he did have a pretty good read on the big shots. But it was maybe, it was close. It was not decisive in his favor at all. And then his corner is like, well, now you have to, great, you're seeing the shots, you have to win the round. And then trying to win the round assures that he will, in fact, lose the round. Because Moreno is absolutely down to meet him in the pocket and just has a better sense of what to do there and where the real openings are. And when it's a good idea to sell out and go for something.
And also, Moreno is simply also giving himself more data to work with in those situations as well.
Yeah.
Because he is constantly letting Erceg punch him. As in, and we mentioned this on the preview as well, he just puts up the high guard.
Yeah.
A lot of the shots are being bounced off him. He is getting an idea of the feel and the rhythm of how Erceg is actually hitting him, whereas Erceg is having to do everything, he's having to build everything without feedback.
Yeah.
And he can't build that feedback because in the very first round, he finds out that, what he wants to do, his ideal game plan of like jabbing and poking at someone and then just leaning back out of the way and countering them is not going to work.
Or ideally,
Moreno is going to charge him.
Ideally, they react badly to the jab and he gets to fucking uppercut their face off or something, which, he landed some slick uppercuts in this fight, but few and far between.
Yeah. But Moreno is going to just stick the high guard up. Sometimes your jabs will get through. It's not like it's a perfect defense, but it's giving him information. And then he clocked Erceg. And then Erceg was, clearly realized, I need to diffuse these punches. And the only way I can do that is by being far away. And so he just could not work his way into his range because he knew that once he did, he had no way of getting back out again without putting himself at risk of just being bum rushed.
Yeah.
Or countered by someone who's actually, who is blocking and getting feedback.
Yeah. I mean, Moreno's defense might look silly sometimes, might be strange. It was a deciding factor in how this fight played out.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, that was you specifically called that out, and it was a good call, because Erceg, when he's working, he looks like a much slicker fighter than Moreno.
Yeah. Much tidier, much tighter punches.
Yep. Moreno still swings wild, but there is a reason why he's doing that. But he's also, as we said, he's someone who relies on his own reach and was up against someone who was taller. And those few tricks he's got for closing distance, where he's going to lunge forward and he's going to weave into a hook and then a giant flailing overhand, all this kind of stuff. It's incredibly risky. And he didn't need to do it all that much. And so, he just kind of rode he was able to just ride just enough activity to be relatively sure that he was winning.
Yeah. And risky how?
He didn't need to make any. What's that?
Risky how?
Yeah.
It leaves you open to a counter.
Exactly.
How are you going to counter if your defense is incompatible with your offense? If every defensive move you make just puts you out of position to respond.
Yeah.
You didn't have to worry about
retrospect,
counters.
This fight does make the Kai Kara-France result look a lot more predictable against Moreno.
Yeah,
against,
absolutely.
Erceg, I mean.
In fact, Yeah, please, go on.
Because Kai Kara-France is simply much better at doing that kind of thing than Brandon Moreno is.
Yeah, and he hits harder.
Has much more. Yeah, he hits harder. He's just got more coordinated rushes. He's just better at it. Like, covers distance faster. Yeah. Looking back at it, you're like, oh yeah, of course.
And in one particular, please finish what you're saying. I'm too excited.
You go.
You're insisting? Okay. Well, I don't know if you caught this, but Laura Sanko, who I do enjoy having on the broadcast, her and DC, good team, good chemistry. Mm-hmm. Refreshing not to have Joe Rogan there. It really is these days. Right in the first round, this was in the first minute of the fight. Here's the quote about Erceg. He talked about the struggle he had in that Kai Kara-France fight. It's something that had plagued him earlier in his career as well. He feels like he has addressed it with some very specific footwork. We're not going to see him necessarily take a step back and look for that check hook, because that is an area where he felt like he was vulnerable to the counter. Literally 6 seconds after she says this, Moreno cracks Erceg with a huge overhand right, while Erceg is doing that thing where he pops up completely upright and tries to lean away with both of his feet rooted to the ground and wings a useless left hook. That left hook never lands for him, by the way. But this thing that he said he had specifically addressed, this is the thing about fighting this level of opponent when you're this unpolished. You can't make those improvements don't stick. It doesn't matter if you even work on them in the gym. Like, now you're fighting for your life. So now you're back to instinct.
Yeah, you are simply too stressed to do things which are not instinctive.
And it happened over and over and over again. The exact same thing that got him in trouble against Kai Kara-France. All throughout the fight. Over and over, this horrible reaction which just leaves him wide open to a lunging overhand right. I mean, it literally happened 6 seconds after she said that. He got cracked and was reeling. It's just sad. It's just, he deserves better than this. That's all I feel.
Yeah. It just goes to show, how difficult it is to learn in the modern UFC, especially in a division as both shallow and dense as flyweight.
Right.
And, if you make yourself one of the people that people care about, you're just going to get these fights over and over again.
I mean, hopefully he'll get a step back now, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's, in some ways, there's a benefit. A guy like Kyoji Horiguchi was able to take a bit of a step back in competition when he left the UFC. He no longer had to fight, just literal title contenders every single match when he was very early in his career. Admittedly, though, he did also leave the UFC on a 3-fight winning streak, including beating Ali Bagatinov and some other pretty decent guys.
Yeah, he was already quite good. As is Steve Erceg. Yeah. I mean, let's be clear. You put Steve Erceg against a top 10 ranked guy who isn't like a title contender. As we said last week, he should have been fighting Amir Albazi.
Yeah.
That's a perfect opponent to give him. That's still somebody that he can, hold his head high, say I'm fighting a good fighter, but this is a guy coming off a loss who's having his own struggles. They both have something to prove. It's a measured test for a clearly still developing fighter who's not there yet. And,
So, speaking of which, maybe he should just fight Kyoji Horiguchi now.
I feel like at this point he needs a bigger step back than that. I know,
I'm being mean.
This is
it's like, oh, he's struggling with blitzes, is he?
He should fight Mr. Blitz, which is both Kyoji Horiguchi's new nickname and a popular brand of ramen. I assume. It's just that, like, they're talking about the improvements he's trying to make, and they just don't materialize. And his corner's giving him advice, which he's not equipped to actually follow. Like, the man is at sea, and he just can't get better in this environment, and he needs to get better. He could be really, really good. And the worrying thing, and I probably tend to be too worried about this. People are very resilient. Fighters bounce back from horrible skids like this all the time. But there's always a possibility that this might prevent him from improving as he may have. Now that he's lost 3 fights, even if he does get a step back. I mean, this is the other thing that I noticed. Like, I was thinking back to that Matt Schnell fight. And yeah, all of Erceg's pre-Pantoja bouts, they had hiccups where he would get nailed, usually by a huge right hand. And it happens in the Schnell fight. He gets overexcited after he stuns him and he just walks into a huge right hand. But the second round of that fight is some really smooth stuff from Erceg. And it is him, like, Matt Schnell is trying to force an exchange. He's just storming after him. And Erceg is very calmly just pivoting, just keeping his lead foot, keeping his shield between him and his opponent, knowing that he is positionally secure and that he's doesn't have to fret about all this bullshit being thrown his way. And then Matt Schnell tries to force the exchange, and Erceg, feeds him a jab, reads the counter coming, drops under with a right hand, comes back up with a left hook. Beautiful finish. That's Erceg, like, using defense with his offense, countering in the pocket, drawing it out, and, like, moving comfortably at range to make sure that when the exchange does happen, it will happen on his terms. And he can't do that anymore, or at least against this level. Like, that's the really worrying thing, is that in some ways he actually looks worse than he did before he got the Pantoja fight. He looks less assured, less technically proficient than he did. It's more just, can I take the shots and am I tough enough to give it back? That's worse than just not improving. That's like he's downgraded himself because of the pure survival element of fighting top contender after top contender. That sucks.
Yep. Unfortunately. Unfortunately that's just the way of the flyweight division. Brandon Royval behind him, before him, had that kind of experience. He just kept getting thrown into the wood chipper until he just kind of climbed out.
Yep, with a radically transformed style, which frankly kind of sucks, but also kind of works.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, he climbed out of the wood chipper and he was like, I've been inspired by this to emulate another form of gardening equipment. And people were like, the chainsaw?
No. No. Wood chips make excellent mulch, but you know what else makes excellent mulch? Leaves. Dry leaves. Yeah, I feel inspired. Yeah, that would be terrible if that's the result of all this. Steve Erceg comes up with some, it's increasingly likely, with like a wholly negative solution to the problems he's facing, and just becomes a really indecisive fighter who is safer, but also like not convincingly good, not principled as he used to be. We shall see. But, I thought a fine fight. Plenty of action. I agree the momentum swings were not positive in nature, but that in itself was actually very interesting to me because of what was already on my mind coming into this one. A lot to take away, a lot of biases confirmed and reinforced, unfortunately, and clear indication, if not to Steve Erceg himself, then to, I'm imagining right now an agent or manager of a UFC fighter who actually cares about anything more than like an opportunity to have a champagne dinner with Dana White to make this man take a step back. He has to be made to take a step back so he can improve. If he doesn't, he will not get better.
And stand straight up in the air whilst he's doing it.
Yeah. There are far more Lando Venatas and Dominic Reyes's and Paige Van Zant's and Sage Northcutt's in UFC history than there are Max Holloway's and Dustin Poirier's and Charles Oliveira's, like, it's just not, they're like fucking J.K. Simmons and Whiplash. Just like trial by fire, the fucking dumbass's way of getting somebody to prove that they're great, while in the meantime destroying, the 90% of prospects that are put into their hands that might have just needed a little nurturing to actually get there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, still, the Erceg Horiguchi fight's going to be cool, though.
Yeah, that's going to be great. They were talking about bringing Horiguchi back, although...
Yeah, I think that he's signed now, I think.
Oh, is he signed? Cool.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know.
Great.
I don't know if they'll be able to tempt him with, presumably he's getting paid decently well compared to UFC pay to do what he's been doing. But if they ponied up and he's back in the UFC, I'll be very excited to see what he can do. And I hope it's not Steve Erceg next. Okay, let's take our first break there then. And when we come back, we may as well get into Josh Emmett versus Lerone Murphy. After that, couple more things worth mentioning, I think, from this Mexico City card. Raul Rosas Jr. had a better performance than he has in the past against Vince Morales, who didn't fight all that terribly by Vince Morales standards. Kevin Borjas, Ronaldo Rodriguez was an absolute blast. And Lupi Godinez, Julia Pilastri was really one of the best women's fights that we've had all year, if not for a good while longer than that. So there's some more stuff to talk about. But first, the featherweights, Emmett, Murphy, after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right. Josh Emmett versus Lerone Murphy. Very obvious what the purpose of a matchup like this is. Josh Emmett is, at this point, the old guard of contenders and elite gatekeeper. Kind of a role that he was in that whole time. He never quite broke through to be a real title challenger himself. But at this point, as we just confirmed, he is fully 40 years old. In fact, it's been nearly a year and a half since his last fight, which was that thunderous knockout of Bryce Mitchell. The one which really was the final proof in Mitchell's mind that the earth was flat. Because when you become that well acquainted with the ground, you're like, surely if it was round, it wouldn't have hurt that hard. It wouldn't have hurt that much. I would have slid or something, you know what I mean? If there was any grade at all. Josh Emmett is, being used here as a fitting opportunity for Lerone Murphy, who isn't all that young himself, but is much less experienced, to prove that he really does have what it takes to be an elite fighter. And I say it in those terms because Murphy had a really professional showing against Edson Barboza that convinced me, as it turned out wrongly, that he had kind of solved his problems with inconsistency, that he had figured out how to stick to a game plan with multiple facets, and that he was going to be just poised and collected and in control of more fights going forward. And then Lerone Murphy fought Dan Ige and made pretty much all the wrong decisions on how to fight him. And very nearly paid for it early and just sort of scraped it out in the end. But certainly not a convincing performance, and not against somebody who is themselves a particularly consistent or fighter or particularly like complicated puzzle to solve. I shouldn't think, for a guy with Lerone Murphy's talents. So we're kind of back to square one, basically, with Lerone Murphy. That's how it feels to me. What do you think?
Yeah. I think that's true.
If not that, then we've at least learned that he's going to be very matchup dependent one way or the other.
Yeah. Because I think, what we've kind of learned from him in general is that he's just one of these guys who's pretty good at everything, and his game plan is broadly going to be the same in pretty much every fight, and his general approach is both directionally and like in terms of where the fight goes, is that we're just gonna fight.
Yeah.
Whatever kind of fight you want to have with me, I will be very confident that I can win that fight against you.
Yeah.
And as you said, the only like real change is the only real like outlier is that Barboza fight.
Yep.
But even then, that's a very unique and idiosyncratic kind of approach to the Barboza game plan, which is just keep him pinned in place with the jab. And the comparison of Ige to Emmett, they're obviously pretty similar. They've occupied similar positions as gatekeepers in the UFC.
Mm-hmm.
Emmett, I think, is. They have like a curious relationship, I think, in how you look at them, because it allows you to reevaluate how important certain aspects are. Because I would say Dan Ige is in most ways a better fighter than Josh Emmett.
Mm-hmm.
He's a better counterpuncher. He's got better. He selects his targets better. He punches in combination. He actually uses his wrestling game offensively. Mm-hmm. He's a good top position grappler. He simply has more skills than Josh Emmett. He also has, whilst Emmett is obviously the better athlete, Ige is not that far behind him, and he has his own, incredible physical attributes, namely that he's completely impossible to knock out.
Yep. He's smaller than Emmett, is one thing.
Yeah.
And he's not so absurdly overpowered, but yeah.
Yeah. Emmett has simply dumped every single point that Ige put into, like, all those different skills into punching hard.
Right.
And the actual outcomes of this are that Emmett is maybe a slightly more accomplished fighter.
Mm-hmm.
Just, like, beaten more people more convincingly.
I mean,
the
Emmett...
Ige versus Bryce Mitchell.
Yep. Ige was really this close to being able to beat Bryce Mitchell and could not convert the advantage. Josh Emmett converted Bryce Mitchell from a living man to a dead one in under 2 minutes. And Emmett also, because of his power, and it has to be said, his toughness, Emmett is a very, very resilient fighter, has also come through in fights that are going badly for him in a way that Dan Ige rarely does. Dan Ige is a little easier to convince that he's not going to win. Josh Emmett is always believing that he might win at any moment.
Yeah.
With good reason, because, like I said, it's happened. That Michael Johnson fight he had years ago wasn't really going well for him. Slept Johnson in the third round,
Yeah. But with these two fights, I also feel like, they're a good example for why styles make fights. Because I think we did pick Mitchell to beat Ige, and then we quite confidently picked Emmett to beat Mitchell in turn. Because you can sort of tell how, at this point, how their skill sets are going to play out. Like, there are certain fighters where it is more helpful to be a more diverse Ige kind of fighter. And my read on this one is that Lerone Murphy is one of them.
Yeah.
Just the broader skill set from Ige just allowed him to cycle through, parts of the game. He was, working the body, then coming upstairs. He was standing, when he knocked Murphy down and hurt him badly, he was standing his ground and counterpunching. He can be an excellent counterpuncher, as we said.
Mm-hmm.
Like, against someone who is strategically sort of directionless and mostly just wants to dictate with like a long jab. That kind of diversity and keeping Murphy unsure of what the fight was going to be, I think worked very, very well for Ige.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that Josh Emmett is going to be able to do that in the same way. I think that, Murphy, like you said with Moreno, he is a natural fighter. This is where I think a lot of that aimlessness kind of comes from.
Yeah.
Is that he's just very, very confident that he's going to outfight his opponent. He's going to find a way to win.
Yeah.
And I think that just that baseline approach of I'm just going to be big and rangy and I'm going to stick out a really dangerous, hard jab.
Yeah, shotgun
obviously,
jab.
Obviously, it opens him up to Emmett charging him, and it opens him up to Emmett like charging him and destroying him with one counter to that jab should he mistime it. But this is the other thing about Emmett sort of dumping all his points into one area of skill, is that Emmett can have really, really bad fights in a way that Ige cannot.
True.
Like,
mm-hmm.
Dan Ige would not, and I say this quite confidently, he just wouldn't have gotten smoked by Yair Rodriguez like that.
No.
He might not have beaten Yair, but he would have given him the same incredibly tough fight that he gives everyone.
Yeah.
But Emmett, being relatively limited, can be put into just like unwinnable fights.
Yeah, just stuck at a range where he has nothing. Stuck on the back foot.
And
I
think Lerone Murphy is almost by accident going to find himself probably in that fight.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Doesn't make me feel as much better about Murphy's chances as I would like. Because Josh Emmett is not as natural a counterpuncher as Ige, for sure. He doesn't just have his feel. I mean, the counter right hand that Ige dropped Murphy with in the first round of their fight, it was while Murphy was going for a ludicrously overextended combination. He went from like some big body kick, and then he was like already off balance, and he was like, I'm going to lunge in with a left hand, and he really winged it. And Ige just had his eyes on him the whole time and just sent a right hand straight up the middle that put him on his ass. That he's got a feel for the timing and the rhythm of exchanges that Josh Emmett lacks. Josh Emmett does, however, have tremendous hand speed and power. And you can pile up on Josh Emmett 3-4 punches, and he will still uncork some really scary counter shots. I mean, it's easy to remember his fight against Ilia Topuria as entirely one-way traffic, and it mostly was, because Topuria never allowed anything to get out of hand. He still ate some heaters on the counter from Emmett. He still walked into a couple of scary left hooks. And that's Ilia Topuria we're talking about. Somebody who is really very, very good defensively and positionally in the pocket. So I'm still concerned about that. Like, that I think, like I said about Emmett, things can be going very badly for him and he can still win. That's the thing. Like, Dan Ige will have fights where he has good moments, but he loses nonetheless. He rarely has a fight where, he just seems like he's at a huge disadvantage and he makes something happen through sheer grit and the willingness to trade. And Josh Emmett has that. And I also don't think Lerone Murphy is necessarily as consistent as Yair Rodriguez happened to be on that night, where Emmett.
Yeah, I agree.
Emmett never got
dangerous to him than
he never.
Again, Emmett.
Yeah,
Emmett against, in the same way that like Emmett Mitchell was quite easy to call. Emmett versus Rodriguez was easy to call because it was just like, oh yeah, you're going to hang around that range against Yair Rodriguez. You're going to do that. Just gonna wait for him to give you something, huh?
He never got a chance to settle or get comfortable from the very beginning. In that fight. That's not how Murphy's fights tend to go. Like, it's not certain that Murphy's gonna win the first round. In fact, he tends to lose them to a lot of opponents before he kind of figures out their timing or makes whatever adjustments he's gonna make. And this is the other thing about that Barboza fight. Why it appeared very consummately professional. But as you said, it wasn't the typical way to beat Barboza. It happened to work really well for Murphy. But the fact is, he went into a fight with Edson Barboza and allowed Barboza to walk him down at kicking range for long stretches. He handled it well. Barboza's on the attack, not actually all that difficult to time. Not all that surprising or creative for a guy who is keeping a good position as Murphy was and fighting behind his jab as Murphy was. But it's not the most obvious strategic read you would make, which forces me to conclude it wasn't a strategic read. It just happened to work. Murphy happened upon that approach and it worked pretty well for him. It was ultimately a pretty aimless fight, directionally speaking. There were moments when he was pressuring Barboza, moments when he was allowing Barboza to pressure him. He maintained control of it for almost that entire time, but many different kinds of fights happened across those rounds. And, I don't know. I do wonder, how much longer can Josh Emmett continue to be, much as I do have respect for Bryce Mitchell's skill set, it's like, if there's a guy that Josh Emmett is going to knock out at this late stage of his career, that's probably it.
Yep.
And if I go back and imagine Josh Emmett now having some of the fights he had earlier in his career, say this Josh Emmett fought the 2022 version of Calvin Kattar. Say he fought the current version of Dan Ige. Would those fights have, and those were close fights to begin with. I don't know. But I do just have a bad feeling that Emmett is going to get some really big moments in this fight.
Yeah, I think it's a good chance. It's always a good chance for Josh Emmett.
Certainly, yeah.
But also I do feel like he really just kind of has to knock Lerone Murphy out in round one. I don't think there's many other ways that I can see him winning this fight. Maybe he knocks him out in round 3.
He's got to knock him out at some point. Certainly, yeah. He's not going to bank a lot of rounds.
Murphy's fights do not generally, the bad point is generally early.
Yes. Yeah, he usually settles in pretty well.
Yeah, good instincts. Just in a way which is often strategically detrimental.
Yeah. I am going to pick Murphy. I think you put him in a long fight and you just simply assume that he doesn't get finished immediately. Which again, higher chance of that happening here than in just about any other fight. But if you make that assumption, then it is another one of those Josh Emmett fights where it's kind of hard to imagine how he picks up the rounds as it goes on. He just only has like two ideas. But he is one of those fighters who can make bad ideas work just by upping the intensity, upping the commitment. So
yep, he is Uriah Faber's truest heir.
Absolutely, yeah. And shit, even Uriah Faber was winning and getting some impressive victories as an old man with that with that steroid regime that T.J. Dillashaw shamefully introduced him to.
How could you, T.J.?
Uriah Faber was a good man before you came around.
I did also like that there was something where he was talking about like BKFC and fighting Henan Barao again. It's like, yeah, I need to get one back on that guy. And I was like, who Uriah?
Who? Yeah, who was he talking about?
Henan Barao.
Oh, Henan Barao. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that means something.
Yeah. The old what's it called? Tito versus Chuck.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Get them when they've fallen off unimaginably hard.
Hoist Gracie, Ken Shamrock 3.
Yeah.
That wasn't a shameful fucking disgrace. Yeah. Yep. By the way, since I was thinking of Cody Garbrandt the other day and just making myself laugh, both about hanging with the boys as Cody's very charming first encounter with real life friends, but also another guy the UFC just roasted to a crisp by rushing him into an early title shot and then never giving him a step back until it was already too late. Anyway, I'm going to stick with Murphy along with you. I'm concerned, though. I think this is a very losable fight.
Yeah. I always is with Josh Emmett, but I think it's...
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, if... It's also, like, one of the more winnable ones for Lauren Murphy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
yeah.
This is one of the stylistic matchups you're going to get where... if you can't control this...
Right. There's just not that much to worry about. It's just that the few things to worry about are very worrying. That's the problem with Josh Emmett. But yeah, I described Dan Ige as somebody who maybe shouldn't have been that difficult for Murphy to solve. I think you may be right. But by the same logic, Josh Emmett really shouldn't be a very difficult fighter to figure out. Even if many of your adjustments are just negative, you're going to get to bank a lot of time where you're just kind of ahead on him. All right. Well, that's next weekend's main event. Let's take one more break. And when we come back, we will pick up some scraps, I think, from this Mexico City undercard after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
Okay, let's talk about some undercard fights from Mexico City. First up, Raul Rosas Jr. versus Vince Morales. I've not been particularly complimentary of Raul Rosas Jr. He is sort of a classic UFC star prospect. I mentioned Sage Northcutt earlier in the card. This is how, the guys the UFC tends to like fixate on really early on when they're very young. They have a certain energy, they have a confidence, and they tend to have a very narrowly defined style which works really, really well until they get like a small step up in competition, and then they are completely out of their depth. The UFC can't tell that these guys aren't going to pan out ever.
I mean, they can't tell this at, many levels of the sport.
Yeah, but the guys that
Especially, now that their prospects are increasingly simply an offshoot of the Dana White Contender Series rot, which makes you pick anyone who wins by wheel kick.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of which, Ronaldo Rodriguez was on this card. We'll talk about him too. Yeah, but like I was talking about mishandled prospects earlier. Steve Erceg was not a guy that they chose to push from early on. He's much more like Dominic Reyes, like somebody who right time, right place, got to that early big chance, and that was what proved that he had something. But really, he was only selected for that fight with Pantoja because they needed a title fight on UFC 301 and Steve Erceg was available. The guys that the UFC pushes from early on, the ones who pop, who have something, who have that it factor, Sage Northcutt, Paige Van Zandt, Raul Rosas Jr., they're all typically fighters who, to us, it appears quite obvious that, Patty Pimblett, another one. It appears quite obvious to us that they don't really have it as a fighter as much as they do as a personality. And I would definitely put Rosas Jr. in that camp. And that's why I've not been very high on him as a prospect, particularly after it was definitively proven in his fight with Christian Rodriguez that he can make a bunch of stupid decisions and defeat himself due to overconfidence. Having said all that, I think we finally saw an improved version of Raul Rosas Jr. in this fight. And to the UFC's credit, they have been matching him pretty gently without giving him too many absolute layups since that Christian Rodriguez fumble. So, at least they're taking their latest iteration of the how did this guy become professional at 17, isn't that illegal kind of star, and they are not simply grinding him into dust from the beginning. And I think we saw some results. Raul Rosas Jr. it's been a subject of conversation in all of his recent fights that he's been working on his striking, and it has always been very funny to see him come out and wing a hilarious overhand right that misses by a mile and then go right immediately to the wrestling. I thought he actually looked like he had a little bit of striking this time. Pressured Vince Morales with the jab, put his ass on the fence, maintained his range and fired some good combinations, gave him a feint, and then hit the takedown. That was a pretty good look. Just at the very start of the fight, Raul Rosas Jr. looked much more collected and calm and balanced on his feet. I consider that a pretty significant step for him. The striking portions of the fight did start to spin out of control. Particularly, I think, at the start of round 2, Vince Morales had one of his bouts of intensity, which he tends to have once or twice in every fight, and was walking Raul Rosas Jr. into the jab and was backing him up and landed a good right hand, was putting some combinations together. Of course, Vince Morales can't get into that kind of striking flow without becoming immediately susceptible to any kind of switch up, and that's when Rosas Jr. hit him with the takedown again. He also committed to a front headlock choke at a very untimely point in round 3 when he might have been able to bank some top time on Rosas Jr. So Raul still benefited from an opponent who was in part beating themselves. But that's all I have to say really is I thought Raul looked okay. He looked like a better fighter than he had in previous fights.
Yeah,
and
he looked like a professional fighter.
Yeah, which is good.
And Morales is he's just a very flawed test.
Yeah.
And there are many ways to solve him.
Yes.
And Rosas Jr. found one and basically stuck to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's relatively admirable. But Morales is essentially he's a kind of throwback fighter,
Mm-hmm.
that, from the like early to mid 2000s that you would kind of find,
Yeah.
in the UFC, and he would be a fan favorite, but he's just doesn't have the depth of skill to compete in the modern division, especially in the modern UFC, and especially in the good divisions.
Yeah,
and
it's bantamweight.
can just be solved in too many ways, and only really wants a pocket boxing match when people don't move their feet very much, and don't low kick, and don't take him down.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think there should be any rush to give Rosas Jr. a significant step
He's
up.
20 years old.
Yeah, let him keep operating at this level. Give several lateral moves for the next year or two at least. And he will get better. He has just shown that you keep letting him cook against people who will test him, but will also make big mistakes. And he is going to keep finding ways to win, to keep his confidence high, while also showing increasing depth of skill. So I liked that. A good sign from Raul Rosas Jr. And it's not his fault that I've been unimpressed with him. It's that feeling is entirely relative to the UFC's apparent perception of his ability and his potential. But he clearly does have potential. And again, to the UFC's credit, if this is even being done on purpose, these have been pretty good fights. Terrence Mitchell was like a layup, get your confidence back fight after the Christian Rodriguez loss. And since then, they've all been scrappy but very beatable fighters. And I think that makes perfect sense for where Rosas Jr. is at in his career and his life as a very young person.
Yeah. Just a question of, like any of these guys, is that eventually at some point you have to give them that step up. And sometimes they just still struggle. Eventually you do have to kind of just throw them in.
Of course.
And sometimes they're just not there for it. But I think Rosas is generally encouraging. I don't know if I have a super high ceiling for him, but I thought he looked much better in this fight.
Me too. Yeah, much better.
Just strategically, technically, frankly, just looked better. He's still not good on the feet, but God, he used to be terrible.
Awful, yeah. And he actually had some timely phase shifts, some good transitions, some setups to his takedowns. And, if you're going to have this kind of game, then you need those ancillary skills to get there reliably. Otherwise, you're just banging your head against a wall against somebody like Christian Rodriguez, who's just ironclad scrambling and wrestling defense.
Yeah.
Before we get to Christian Rodriguez, I do want to talk about the UFC's other kind of contender series pickup, although this man did not actually, as it happens, come from the contender series. He is the kind of guy that, makes Dana White hoot and clap like a seal whenever he sees them. Dynamic spin kick man. Ronaldo Rodriguez, who showed up. Oh, by the way, as I get into this, because I remember it being mentioned at the beginning of the fight, I think the UFC fighters have figured out what it means to fight nearly a mile above sea level. Because that was the other thing about this. What's that?
Some of them have.
Yeah, but there wasn't really many fights.
Joe Pfeiffer hasn't.
Well, was it the sea level or was it like a bad street taco he ate or something? What happened? What's the story there?
Apparently, this is going to be probably going to be a post. Well, it's not even a post-fight rationalization. It's just a rationalization.
He ate a taco prepared for him by Kelvin Gastelum, who has famously gotten food sick from tacos before.
Wait a minute. Let me see if I can find it. Is that he basically? I think he was sleeping in an altitude tent or something. And then he just went to Mexico City, and then he still got altitude sick, and then he was like, "This is bullshit."
Okay, all right.
So what did he say? I don't care if it's offensive to you. I will never go back to that country. I did everything right. I slept in a tent. I did all this work, still get sick. Some people are saying it wasn't the food, saying I got altitude sickness. If that's what altitude and elevation is, fuck that country. I will never fight there again. Shithole. Not going back. Don't care that it's offensive to you. You're not the one fighting. Suck my balls, literally.
Wow, very mature. It's Mexico's fault. Fuck Mexico.
Yeah.
Shut up,
If
you
that's
fucking
what
baby.
Altitude and elevation is, fuck that country.
By the way,
How dare it be tall?
most of Mexico is not that tall. So
Yeah,
it's
that
just
makes
Mexico
it even
City.
worse. It's just that particular part made itself tall just to fuck with Joe Pfeiffer.
The volcano that
God
formed
damn.
the Caldera
Yeah, exactly.
Lake on which Mexico City is
Yeah.
built several million years ago did it specifically to spite Joe Pfeiffer. And the Mexicans were in on it.
Those plates and subduction zones, they were all in on it.
Damn you,
They were like-
Quetzalcoatl.
Yeah. And they started grinding up against each other, however many hundreds of millions of years ago to create that. They were like, the fuck with Joe Pfeiffer.
What a funny reaction. I went there and got sick.
Great.
I did everything right. Fuck Mexico. Shithole
Also,
country.
it's like,
Jesus, you're a
you could have
fucking
gone there
moron.
early. He was like, no, I did everything right. I slept in a tent. I slept in a tent, man.
The tent doesn't work. The tent doesn't work. I bet he wore the mask too when he was training. I was out of breath the whole training camp, and still I went a mile above the ocean and I felt bad. Idiot. Well, anyway, Joe Pfeiffer accepted. The fights that actually did happen on this card were not broadly defined by people gassing out shockingly, about 8 minutes sooner than they would normally. So I think most of the fighters here were like in Mexico City for a month before the fight and handled it very well.
Yes.
Ronaldo Rodriguez was one of them because
Also, they only booked two fights, because Joe Pfeiffer, obviously, above welterweight, which was a very good idea.
that's a good idea too.
The only middleweight who actually didn't die at elevation, they won their fight in one round.
That's true. Yeah, the freakishly talented, if unbelievably raw, Ateba Gautier. Although he looked kind of good compared to how he's looked before this. So, and he's a very, very scary athlete. And also they gave him an absolute layup in Jose Medina, who is not a UFC level fighter by any definition. But the reason I brought this up is that Daniel Cormier pegged it as a concern for Ronaldo Rodriguez because he came out and the first thing he did was a giant wheel kick, and the next thing he did was a fucking like scissor kick, jumping double kick, Taekwondo style, which actually kind of landed. And Cormier was like, he seems charged up and really excited, and that could be a problem with the altitude here. It turned out it wasn't. Rodriguez's gas tank wasn't a problem at all. Despite the overall inefficiency of his style, what was a problem is that he's a super duper hittable fighter. Kevin Borjas is a pretty good MMA boxer, and more to the point, unlike Ode Osborne, who just about knocked Rodriguez out cold and then woke him back up with the follow-up before losing to his grappling game in Rodriguez's last fight, Borjas simply stuck to the shit that was working. Namely, the counter right hand, which he found about a dozen different ways of landing, and it just landed for free almost every single time. I don't have much more to say about the fight, except that I enjoy Borjas' style. I was worried that he would be just athletically outmatched here, but it goes to show, as often as we're reminded that technique is not everything or even often the most important thing, it does still matter. And Kevin Borjas, knowing when to tuck his chin and put his hands up, knowing when to sidestep out of danger, knowing how to move his head and throw at the same time, it prevailed in this matchup. There wasn't a single point at which Rodriguez was technically equipped to figure out what was going wrong. He just kept trying to up the intensity, And that just resulted in him running into harder and harder right hands.
Yep.
Good shit from Kevin Borjas. He's a lot of fun.
Yeah, enjoyed it a lot. He's like the flyweight Damir Ismagulov.
Yeah. I do really enjoy his style. Who missed weight in this one, by the way? It was Rodriguez. Okay, that makes me feel even better about Borjas' win. Down on the prelims now. Just a couple quick things to mention. First of all, because I don't have as much to say about it technically, although there is some stuff to talk about, which, if you want to hear me talk about it in more detail, doubtless it will be covered on this week's bonus portion of the MMA Vivisection with Zane Simon, because he loves him some Lope Godinez, and we always talk about last week's fight on our bonus recap segment. That's for subscribers only. But on this night, you're aware of that bit too, Phil? Oh, I think we had you do it once on the Depressed, didn't we?
I think so, yeah.
Subscribers only. On this night, Lupe Godinez fought a woman by the name of Julia Pilastri. The commentators were pronouncing that very strangely. They were saying like Palaustri or Paloistri. I don't know if there's some kind of Brazilian Portuguese nasal sound in there, maybe, that's perhaps being misconstrued, or maybe I just don't know. I'm just going to call her Pilastri for now. I was a little concerned for Lupe Godinez for reasons that became evident, fortunately for her, not till the third round of this fight. I was worried because Pilastri is scary. She gives a dangerous vibe if you watch just any moment. A little bit like Wong Kong. Mm-hmm. She's got a little, Jason Terminator kind of energy about her. And Godinez is like just this far from being the female Bilal Muhammad. She really kind of has the exact same elements of her game, and that she's not a tremendous athlete, but she's not bad. And she's got a high output boxing game with a good jab, and she's got some really nice timely takedowns. And also, like Bilal Muhammad, not necessarily that much idea of how to effectively follow up on those takedowns. But sometimes that just means she can get you down, let you up, and get you down again and win a round like that. But she doesn't have the game planning gene that makes Bilal Muhammad so much of a consistent overachiever. And I was worried that she might allow Pilastri to back her up, as she often has against big, intimidating opponents, and that this would lose her the fight. As it turned out, she pressured the hell out of Pilastri for the first 2 rounds. When she was pushed back, she would meet her with a hard jab or a hard right hand left hook and then take her down with excellent timing. And fortunately for her, Pilastri's takedown defense is not much to look at. So it was looking like a really great performance from Godinez. Round 3, Pilastri had reached her limit break. She had decided she didn't care anymore. She wasn't going to respect what was coming back at her. And unfortunately, it has to be said, Ms. Godinez had informed her corner between rounds 2 and 3 that she felt a certain urge to make a poopy Godinez, if you will.
I was going to call you out if you didn't say it again.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
And it was very hard not to read that into every moment of the third round. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat being like, I don't want to see anything running down this woman's thighs. Please, God, don't let it happen. Oh. And, I think any of us who's trained, you've been there. You've had some gastrointestinal discomfort, which is really, really distracting. It's like, how you take a body shot and then you just like drop your hands and let yourself get hit in the face? And like normally instinctively your body would never let you do that, but the right kind of body punishment will kind of rewire your instinctive priorities. That happens when you really need to shit too. Where you're just like, I might die if I don't defend myself.
Must poo.
But if I defend myself with full attention and intensity, something might sneak out. And maybe that was part of it. But I think the larger part was Pilastri just truly going 80s slasher mode and walking through everything Godinez threw at her and just hammering her with savage combinations. And all of this is to say it resulted in a really sick fight. Which it started off with the Mexican crowd going fucking wild as Godinez was like power bombing Pilastri and nailing her with 3-punch combinations. And then it ended with the crowd going even crazier as Godinez did everything she could to scare Pilastri off when Pilastri was just beyond fear. Really, really exciting. One of the best women's fights in any women's weight class that I've seen in some time. A really, really solid brawl.
Yep. Twists, turns, and then tension right at the end.
Yeah, tension of a very specific kind.
Yep.
The last thing I want to talk about.
Watching that
one. I was on the edge of my seat, by which I mean a chair, to be clear.
Yes.
A normal chair. Last one I want to mention, because he is one of my boys, and you know how my boys tend to go, Phil. Christian Rodriguez was matched with Melquizael Costa. And I expected Rodriguez to win this fight because when I love somebody, I never imagine that they can fail until it's too late and I have to accept the truth. But
I was impressed by Costa in this.
Yeah, me too. I mean, holy shit, Costa, like, knowing how good Rodriguez's mat wrestling and scrambling is, the fact that Costa was able to sweep him multiple times, put him in threatening submissions multiple times, Costa's scrambling was on point. I did not expect him to be out positioning Rodriguez on the ground like that.
Yeah.
But I think it really does put a point on. It really, in a final sort of way, defines who Christian Rodriguez is as a fighter for now. Because we have now gotten the opportunity to see Rodriguez matched against 3 overwhelmingly physical, aggressive, but without exception, very young and inexperienced wrestlers. And he's beaten them all. And they haven't all been as convincing or as ironclad as victories as the one over Raul Rosas Jr. was. There's no question about that one. But they've all felt like well-earned victories. Because these guys go in there, they have one goal in mind. It is to barnstorm the opponent and fling them onto their back as hard as they can and then mash them to a pulp. And these guys just cannot beat Christian Rodriguez. And the assumption is maybe that this is because Christian Rodriguez's wrestling and grappling is way too good. And it is really, really good. But now, seeing this and the Julian Erosa fight that Rodriguez also lost, another one where he was surprisingly submitted by somebody, like both of these have been people in part out-grappling him. It does underscore the fact that a key element of all 3 of those wins was the inexperience of Rodriguez's opponents. Because these are all fighters who will bang their head into the wall until they knock themselves out. They are unimaginative, inflexible, overconfident. You know, young super prospects. And Rodriguez being defensively sound and poised and refusing to accept bad positions, just continually fighting back in a very young veteran way, it allows that kind of fighter to destroy themselves. And then Rodriguez can kind of just accept the win. When he's fighting somebody like Julian Erosa, who is certainly beatable in all sorts of ways, or Melquizael Costa, who is, you know, typically a very kind of formless, aimless fighter, then nonetheless, these are experienced opponents, and the onus is on Christian Rodriguez to go out there and beat them. And that is clearly something he struggles with. He had the game plan here to out-wrestle Costa, which I thought was kind of strange because, you know, I don't think Rodriguez is, striking, I think, is clearly his weakest area. He's just like more prone to kind of lapses and bouts of inactivity, and he overcommits on his shots and stuff like that. But he's not a bad striker. He has a lot of great fundamentals on the feet. He had that fight with Cameron Simon, where he handled him really well. Walked him into counter right hands, kept him on the end of the jab. Just a very professional looking boxing performance from Rodriguez. But clearly he didn't feel confident in that against Costa. He thought the wrestling was going to be the way through. And he wasn't really capable of adjusting when he needed to adjust. Even though the entirety of the first round really demonstrated that it just wasn't going to work that well. I mean, like, he was able to hit Melquizael Costa with about 320 foot sweeps, which Daniel Cormier was cracking up about on the broadcast. He was like, how does this same takedown keep working? I love when Daniel Cormier gets like mad at somebody for not figuring out how to wrestle. And Rodriguez was hitting Costa with the same like Muay Thai foot sweep over and over and over again, but he just couldn't secure a good position. And outside of that foot sweep, he couldn't make any other kind of takedown happen either. He's just sort of got stalled out in a lot of clinches. And it wasn't until round 3 when Duke Rufus had, you know, berated him in the corner and said, you need to go out there and finish him, that he started throwing with intention and actually entering the pocket. And he was landing. He was landing big shots. Unfortunately, all of those big shots were immediately followed by him falling into the clinch, which then it prevented him from building any kind of real momentum. But it was already too late to make that kind of adjustment. And it just sort of reminded me that Rodriguez appears much more experienced than he actually is against a more typical species of prospect.
I mean, yeah, it's worth noting that, like, he has made large skill jumps.
Oh, yeah.
Because he looks like relative, you know, like a quality fighter. He's made large skill jumps in a short amount of time. Like that fight he had against Raul Rosas Jr. was itself kind of as much of a jump as Raul Rosas Jr.'s last one against Vincent Morales.
Absolutely. I didn't pick him there because his fight preceding that, I can't remember who it was right now, he got out-wrestled and lost. And then he went in there and I was like, holy shit, look at him. He's a beast on the ground.
Yeah.
So yeah,
my read on him is that mostly he does like function well as essentially an anti-grappler.
Yes.
Right? He's a who's the guy in the middleweight division who got knocked out by Brad Tavares?
Gregory Rodriguez? No, he knocked out Brad Tavares.
No, did not get knocked out.
Who got knocked out by Brad Tavares? Who has ever gotten knocked out by Brad Tavares?
Christoph Yotko. He's been like Christoph Yotko.
Yeah.
He's just like a super good scrambler, and he's poisonous against most dedicated grapplers. Yeah. Because he's just a super good scrambler, and he's good enough on the feet that he can make them look stupid there.
Yeah.
But, you know, against a defined striker, he's in trouble. And against a good enough grappler, he can also be in trouble. And that's why this one actually impressed me. It was because, what's his face?
Costa, Melquizael Costa.
Costa, yeah. He managed to beat Rodriguez like mostly at his own game, and not even. And what I thought was sort of impressive here that made me think that he has a genuinely good ceiling is that it wasn't actually like, despite the fact that he was able to sweep him and did well against him in the grappling exchanges, it wasn't really like a technical win. It was simply that he hit a pace that Rodriguez could not possibly keep up with.
Yeah.
And he did do that at Mexico City.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of like physical ability to push it was a very, very high pace.
Yeah.
That he was pushing in the grappling,
Mm-hmm.
like in Mexico City. And that is just a very, very useful thing to have, as Merab Dvalishvili can tell you.
Yeah, they both showed tremendous stamina. Jesus.
Yeah, but I think that was the key thing, is that this guy could just keep going past points where Christian Rodriguez couldn't, just physically.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that was genuinely impressive.
I agree. And to be clear, I'm certainly not saying like, Rodriguez is cooked or he's not going to pan out. It's just a funny thing to see him sort of losing as the less experienced guy in the same way those other less experienced guys lost to him. Trying to force a sort of wrestling grappling dominance that wasn't really materializing and that he couldn't find a way to build on or adjust his way out of until it was too late. It was just a helpful reminder that Christian Rodriguez is not a veteran. He's a young veteran. He is, in fact, still an inexperienced, pretty young fighter. And there's a deceptive appearance in those wonderful anti-wrestler matchups of his that he is just one of these guys who gets it way before his time, way before his prime. But the reality is he's still a young fighter who can make silly decisions, and there's still a lot of stuff he doesn't know. And a lot of comfort he doesn't have. And when the onus is on him to go out there and make the win happen by force, he can make bad mistakes. It's now cost him twice against much more experienced fighters. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, he just doesn't really have the leeway to make bad mistakes because he's
a
very good athlete.
That too. Yeah, he's operating on that Jack Shore level of athleticism. So it's got to be fantastic decision making, or Costa looked like a full weight class bigger than him, if not more. Mm-hmm. Rodriguez is not a big featherweight. So a very interesting one, nonetheless, I think. Showed that, as Costa has already proven before, he's a guy who can be sort of getting pushed around by his opponent, but just refuses to lose. And that's a great ability to have. And also, I think quite helpfully caused me to reevaluate how I'm going to look at Rodriguez going forward, and that I will be looking for improvements out of him, not just expecting him to go from strength to strength, because he's not there yet. That's all. All right. Well, I think that's all I've got on the Mexico City card. There's a couple other fights coming up on next week's card, but I don't want to talk about them before I have to, which is to say tomorrow.
Yeah. It's mostly like, they're like mostly half fun fights.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard Apex fare. A bunch of guys you sort of know against a bunch of guys who came off the Contender Series.
Yep. I'm happy to see Davy Grant and Victor Henry, but, they could have just fought each other in a better world.
Yeah, right?
That would be awesome.
That would be cool. Oh, well. Okay. Well, we will be back next week to talk about that. Hopefully something interesting happens. Certainly, whether it's a good fight or not, we will have plenty to say about Murphy versus Emmett. After that, it's on to UFC 314. Which is Volkanovski versus Lopez for the now vacant featherweight title. Also, Michael Chandler versus Paddy Pimblett.
Yay!
Boy, Michael Chandler really deserves to lose that fight, just morally.
So funny.
I don't know if it's going to happen, but I will be praying for it until then. Bryce Mitchell is being fed to Jean Silva, because I guess that Josh Emmett KO was not enough for the cruel masters at the UFC. And Yair Rodriguez is meeting in his UFC debut Patricio Pitbull. There's some
That is a banger.
There's some interesting stuff on this pay-per-view card, it has to be said. Does not look at all bad, at least as of now, 2 weeks out. We'll see what happens, but we'll be talking about that one next week. And until then, please find us on social media at Evil Greg Jackson. That's Phil. At Boxing Bush. That's me. Those are both on Twitter. You can find me at King Typo on Blue Sky. Please check out the Heavy Hands Patreon if you haven't heard them already. We had 2 very fun episodes of Heavy Henka, our sumo recap series that Miguel Class and I do together last month. Yeah. Check out my Substack as well, facepunching.substack.com. Otherwise, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.